Defiled hands. In Mark chapter 7, we find a controversy narrative involving the disciples, the Pharisees and scribes, and Jesus concerning the importance of ritual hand washing. According to verse 2, the Pharisees had seen some of the disciples eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. In the next verses 3 and 4, Mark explains the background of the hand-washing tradition, indicating that it was a tradition of the elders, a reference to the oral interpretation of the Torah. It was not only the hands that were to be washed. Mark tells his readers that the Pharisees observed the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. Cleanliness was next to godliness. The Pharisees and scribes ask Jesus in verse 5, "Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" They have taken offense at the disciples' utter lack of regard for the Pharisees' interpretation of the Torah. But Jesus will not have any of it and launches his own diatribe against them, first quoting from the prophet Isaiah in verses 6 through 7, after which he says, "You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition." In verses 9 through 13, he continues the theme of the Pharisees' preference for human tradition to the detriment of what God had actually commanded. He then gathers the crowd and tells them in verses 14 through 15, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile." When Jesus returns home, the disciples ask him about what had just transpired. As usual, they don't get it, and Jesus says as much in verse 18. "Then do you also fail to understand?" He then tells them that nothing that goes into a person through eating can defile a person, since it doesn't enter the heart, but the stomach, and eventually ends up in the sewer. Rather, he says in verse 20, it's what comes out from a person that defiles. Evil intentions like fornication, theft, adultery, and more. These, Jesus says, come from within, from the heart, and they defile a person. But let's back up for just a moment to the end of verse 19. Jesus told the disciples that it isn't what goes into a person that defiles them, since it goes into the stomach and out into the sewer. And then Mark adds this editorial comment. Thus he declared all foods clean. This is important because it suggests that Jesus was abandoning kosher law as it pertained to food. Historically, this seems implausible. Jesus was a law-observant Jew, and it's doubtful he would have intended that all foods were clean, that is, kosher. Yet, Mark writes for the benefit of the audience a little note that asserts that this is what Jesus intended. Here's where things get interesting. In Matthew's version of the same story, in Matthew chapter 15, verses 1 through 20, we see a close replication of the story of Mark with a few key differences, the most prominent of which is that Mark's comment that Jesus was declaring all foods clean is gone. It should follow Matthew 15:17, but check it. It's gone. Matthew has deleted it. But why? That is the topic of today's episode. Welcome to Amateur Exegesis. Before we consider why Matthew has changed Mark's account, let's return to the subject of hand-washing. I've seen many an atheist lambaste Jesus for suggesting that washing one's hands is no big deal. For example, in his Skeptic's Annotated Bible, Steve Wells writes a note on Matthew chapter 15 verses 1 through 7 that ends by saying that maybe Jesus was just making excuses for not washing his hands before eating. My kids used to do that when it was time to eat. But this is, frankly, just plain dumb. The reason we wash our hands today, and why we tell our children to do so before they eat, is because we are now aware of microscopic organisms that, if ingested, can make us ill. So, to combat them, we wash our hands, typically with some kind of antibacterial soap. No one in Jesus' day knew about bacteria, and so that wasn't the reason the Pharisees formulated the rule to wash one's hands. But what was the reason? The first thing we need to observe is how this ritual is spoken of in Mark's Gospel. Flip back to it and give it another read. You can hit the pause button if you like. Both Mark and the Pharisees refer to it as the tradition of the elders in verses 3 and 5. And Jesus contrasts this tradition with the commandment of God in verses 8 through 13, telling the Pharisees that they were making void the word of God through your tradition that you have handed on. These two pieces of evidence, its description as the tradition of the elders and Jesus' contrasting it with the commandment of God, suggest that this ritualistic hand-washing before meals is not something prescribed by the Torah. And in fact, this is exactly what we find. There aren't many references to the washing of hands in the Torah. In Leviticus chapter 15, for example, there are regulations concerning a zav, a person with a genital discharge. In verse 11 we read that if the zav does not wash his hands, and he comes in contact with anyone, then the one with whom he has come in contact must wash their clothes, bathe in water, and remain unclean until the evening. But what if the zav does wash their hands? Well, as Jacob Milgram points out in his commentary on Leviticus, it means he can touch persons, vessels, utensils, anything unless it is underneath him. Thus, he can live at home. Hand-washing is also associated with cultic ritual. In Exodus chapter 30, Aaron and his sons are commanded in verse 19 to wash their hands and feet in the water from the bronze basin that stands in between the tabernacle and the altar. Failing to do so, we are told in verses 20 and 21, results in death. One cannot approach God while unclean. It is this concern for ritual cleanliness that informs us as to the origin of the hand-washing ritual mentioned in Mark. Darrell Bach, in his commentary on the Gospel of Mark, writes that the practice of hand-washing which originated with the Israelite cult was extended to the home for all by the Pharisees and Essenes, perhaps with the view that the home was a small version of the temple. For the Pharisees, the ritual was born out of good intentions. Through the course of one's day, it's possible that they may have come in contact with something that was unclean, persons or food. By washing their hands, any uncleanliness that may have been on their hands would not be transferred to what they eat, and therefore ingested, making them ritually unclean. And since such uncleanness put in jeopardy participating in the Jewish cult, and therefore their relationship with the divine, the Pharisees created what has been described as a fence around the Torah. Was it prescribed by God? No. But it was a natural extension of what God had prescribed. Yet Jesus wasn't convinced. In verse 9, Jesus gets a bit snippy with the Pharisees, saying to them, You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to keep your tradition. This is a good example of the sarcasm Jesus uses from time to time in the canonical Gospels. He isn't exactly complimenting them for their rejection of God's commands. And, as verses 10 through 13 are intended to show, their traditions are intentional attempts to circumvent it, making void the word of God, as verse 13 says. Moses, Jesus tells them in verse 10, wrote, "Honor your father and your mother, and whoever speaks evil of father or mother must surely die." Here, Jesus is thinking of two texts, Exodus 20, verse 12, and Exodus 21, verse 17. These are God's words to Moses. And yet, the Pharisees ignore them, specifically in the context of offering material support for their parents. By declaring their resources as korban, an offering to God, they exempt themselves from supporting their father and mother. By this, they dishonor them, in violation of Exodus 20:12, and they deserve to be put to death, in accordance with Exodus 21:17. Here's what God told you to do, Jesus is saying to them, but here's what you do instead. And he lumps hand-washing right in there with these other attempts to ignore God's explicit commands. So, the Markan Jesus castigates the Pharisees for their violations of the Torah, of God's commandments. And this makes what we read in verse 15 and at the end of verse 19 all the more perplexing. The Markan Jesus outright states that there is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, since, according to verse 19, it enters not the heart but the stomach, and goes out into the sewer. What else should Mark conclude but that by this he declared all foods clean? But Matthew's take on this story is, as we noted earlier, different. In Matthew 15, verse 12, the disciples approach Jesus and inform him that the Pharisees took offense at his words, leading Jesus to explain that the Pharisees, who represented the religious elite in post-70 CE Judaism, were a plant that God would uproot. Furthermore, they were blind guides of the blind and would end up in a pit. Mark's gospel lacks this bit, and it is one of the things that sets the two gospels apart. While the Pharisees in Mark's gospel are certainly cast in the role of antagonists, it is far more pronounced in the Gospel of Matthew. For example, in Matthew 23, we see an extended polemic against the scribes and the Pharisees, hypocrites in the Matthean vocabulary. In fact, it is in that chapter that Matthew reiterates the notion that the Pharisees were blind guides. But Matthew lacks some Markan material as well. For example, in Mark chapter 7, verses 3 through 4, we read Mark's explanation behind the practice of hand-washing. But this is missing from the Gospel of Matthew. Why? It has to do with their respective audiences. The only reason to include this lengthy explanation is if one's audience may find that which you are speaking of obscure. This suggests then that a significant portion of Mark's audience were Gentiles, non-Jews, who would not have been intimately familiar with some of the rituals associated with Judaism, or sects of Judaism. But if Mark included it for the benefit of his Gentile audience, then it stands to reason that Matthew has omitted it because he did not find it necessary to include it. And he would have found it unnecessary if his audience was Jewish, and therefore familiar with such a ritual. It should go without saying that Jesus' earliest followers were all Torah-observant Jews, and there's no reason to think that following Jesus' death that these followers would have abandoned going to the local synagogue on the Sabbath or from celebrating Jewish festivals. In fact, in his epistle to the Galatians, the Apostle Paul records a confrontation he had with Peter over table fellowship, claiming that Peter was fine with eating beside Gentiles until members of the circumcision faction of James came, at which time Peter withdrew from eating with them. This tells us that within early Christianity, there were at least two factions. A faction which sought to not only remain Torah observant, but perhaps sought to make Gentiles Torah observant as well, which Paul refers to with the moniker circumcision, and a faction to which Paul belonged, which did not desire to force the Torah upon Gentiles, but instead stressed justification by faith in Jesus, and not by works of the law. If we had to choose into which category Matthew and his audience fell, it would almost certainly be the circumcision faction. One piece of evidence to support this is found in the Sermon on the Mount. There, in Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 20, Jesus tells his disciples that he did not come to abolish the law or prophets, but rather to fulfill them. And in verse 19, he says that whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Following this, Jesus erects his own fence around the Torah concerning anger, adultery, divorce, oaths, and retaliation. As we noted in episode 3, Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew is cast as a new Moses, the authoritative interpreter of the Torah, and therefore lays down for his people, the new Israel represented by the 12, the true meaning of the Torah. The Sermon on the Mount, writes L. Michael White, focuses on Torah observance and piety as the proper path to righteousness. It stands as a call to discipleship under the guidelines of the Torah. But Jesus doesn't advocate for to-the-letter observance. He goes deeper, into the heart of people. For example, in verses 21 through 26, Jesus suggests that to avoid murder, one must avoid anger and insult. Anger, then, is a path that leads to the heinousness of homicide. Similarly, in verses 27 through 30, Jesus suggests that one must guard not simply against the physical act of marital unfaithfulness, but the mental act as well. Everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Thus, radical steps should be taken to avoid going down a path which could lead to adultery. Guard the right thing, Jesus suggests, and you won't do the wrong thing. This view of the Torah informs the Matthean Jesus' understanding of hand-washing. By stressing the ritual, the Pharisees thought they were keeping themselves pure before God. But Jesus knows that this is an exercise in missing the point. One can maintain ritual purity and still be unclean, since it is from within, from the heart of people, that wickedness comes. Things like murder and adultery. These are what defile a person, Jesus says to his disciples in Matthew 15:20. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile. The Pharisees were placing the emphasis on the wrong thing. But so was Mark. Mark interpreted Jesus' words in Mark 7:19 to mean that he was declaring all foods were clean. But Torah-observant Jesus would not have meant such a thing. He had not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. So, Matthew omits the Markan comment. As Howard Clark writes, hence the implication is that although inner purity is superior, the dietary laws remain valid, as Matthew once again allows for both the claims of the ideal and the necessities of the practical. This disagreement between the two evangelists highlights the ways in which their respective communities viewed Jewish law. For Mark, it wasn't an absolute necessity. He would have been comfortable in Paul's faction. But for Matthew, the Torah wasn't optional. He would have been comfortable in the circumcision faction. Once again, these incongruities demonstrate the nature of the gospel accounts. They aren't impassioned retellings of the Jesus story, focused on historically accurate details. They are Christian texts focused on Christian themes for Christian communities. And these communities weren't monolithic. They existed in different historical contexts and had varying needs. So the authors, in their wisdom, tailored their biographies of Jesus to fit those contexts and needs. In the next episode of Amateur Exegesis, the final episode, we will wrap things up and summarize some of the things we've learned in our brief examination of just a few of the incongruities in the canonical Gospels. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a rating and review over on iTunes. You can also send me your comments, suggestions, and snide remarks to amateurexegete@gmail.com. So I'll see you next time in the final episode of this season of Amateur Exegesis.